Chapter 6. While Wes wrote, Heather worked on getting her son out of the hospital. Under the circumstances, Dr. Hefner wasn't about to release Dylan. She was on the trail of an exciting diagnosis, childhood schizophrenia, and seemed ready to do everything in her power to hold on to her patient. Heather meant to head the doctor off at the pass. Unfortunately, she had no ammo to fight with, so she went to the library to learn what she could about the disorder. She hoped research might turn up something that even Dr. Hefner was overlooking in her zeal. The tremendous volume of material on the subject was overwhelming at first. The librarian had to help her narrow it down. Finally, she left the library with an armload of reference books, magazine clippings, Xeroxes of important articles, and more. The information swarmed her table at dinner and covered her bed when she went upstairs for the night. Another item followed Heather wherever she went: her coffee maker. There would be no sleep until Dylan was home and Wes finished the script. As long as she kept awake, she was safe, and when Dylan came home, he'd be safe too. The clock read 12:30 a.m. when she looked at it for the second time. The first time it had read 7:30 p.m. Turning back to the page of the book she was reading, Heather picked up where she left off. Her finger traced each line of each complex paragraph. The language was technical and hard to read, but she forced herself to understand every word, or to read it over until she did. Heather glanced at the yellow legal pad beside her. A pattern was forming in her scrawled notes, but it wasn't the one she was looking for. Then she looked back to the text and read, "Incipients of aphasia commonly preceded by periods of acute irritability, delusional accounts of shadow figures, hearing of voices, seizures, nausea, and emesis." Though the phrases came to her in fragments, their overall meaning was burning itself into her mind. This had all happened to Dylan, and they were all symptoms of schizophrenia. No wonder the doctor had come to that conclusion, and in a moment of panic, Heather thought that maybe the doctor was right. She leaned back and let go of the book. Caffeine and confusion mingled. Had she spoken to Wes today? Maybe they were both off their rockers. "No," she shouted to herself. "This is happening. You just haven't gone far enough yet. Keep pushing. For Dylan's sake. For Chase." She suddenly realized that her strong inner voice had returned. But it was too late to tell whether the fearful voice was truly gone or had merely gone temporarily hoarse from overuse. When she returned to the book, her place was lost, but only momentarily. Soon she was back on track, but without much hope. She read each word, sinking her deeper into despair. Then she found it, right there on the page headed Sleep Disorders. Many of the symptoms of schizophrenia are duplicated in children suffering from sleep deprivation. She looked again at the word sleep deprivation. Of course, Dylan had probably kept himself from falling asleep to escape the mean man. But without coffee, he had only been partially successful. He was a little kid after all, and intense fear tends to shut the body down as often as it revs it up. When he had fallen asleep, because he was too tired to fight it or because he thought he was safe, he had been vulnerable to attack. Now she had something to bring to Dr. Hefner. But would it be enough to make the doctor give her son back? That was for tomorrow. If they both could get through the night, she'd take care of it then. She hoped Wes was making progress, but he had told her it could be slow going. He couldn't make the dreams come. She reached for the cup of coffee at her bedside table. A strange feeling came over her, and she stopped her hand just inches away. Heather looked at the cup. Small concentric rings were emanating from the center of its black surface. They became more pronounced until the coffee began to slosh over the edge of the cup. She braced herself for the coming earthquake. A distinct low rumble had started and was growing. This was a new kind of quake, coming on slowly rather than hitting all at once. She looked around the room, waiting for it to take off. Then she heard a tiny ping and realized her bedroom television had turned itself on. The screen buzzed as a picture faded onto the screen, sound coming with it. A news report was showing devastation from the recent earthquakes. "A 6-point quake on the Richter scale," a newscaster was reading, "bringing scattered destruction throughout the LA basin." Images of walls fallen onto cars, broken windows, and crumbled freeway overpasses paraded by until she found the remote. She pointed and zapped. The television blinked off. The low rumbling of the earthquake continued. She wondered if it would get any worse. Then the television blinked back on. A picture leaped to the screen immediately. She raised the remote to turn it off again when she saw pictures of Terry and Chuck. The newscaster looked up from the copy and seemed to be talking specifically to her. The world of horror films suffered its own terror today as two of Hollywood's best-known special effects technicians were found dead in a vacant field. Between the photos of Terry and Chuck was a logo in the design of Freddy's claw with the words real-life horror. Heather covered her mouth to stifle a cry. Terrence Feinstein and Charles Wilson, the announcer continued, two special effects artists reputedly working on a top-secret project for the makers of the Freddy Krueger films, were found brutally slashed to death early this. Heather turned it off, unable to watch any more. She had forgotten that Terry and Chuck had been missing the day she called Chase, the day he had died. It never crossed her mind that they hadn't been at the funeral. Freddy had murdered them as well. The television popped on again as the newscast was just ending. Freddy's glove was missing, and police are speculating whether the murders were the result of a botched theft of. An electronic crackling came from within the television. The picture scrambled, became snow, then blacked out completely. Something inside popped, and a bluish flare lit the screen momentarily. Then nothing, just a thin wisp of smoke rising from the back. Heather pressed herself back against her bed, afraid it might yet explode. The silence was broken by the telephone ringing. Heather looked at her clock again. It was almost 1 a.m. Who would be calling at this hour, unless it was him? She would not answer the phone. It continued to ring until her answering machine picked it up. Instead of Freddy, Sarah Reicher's voice echoed through the empty house. She sounded upset. Heather, this is Sarah. Sorry to call you so late, but this is kinda hard. I don't know if you've seen the news, but we were thinking we might shelve the new Nightmare project for a while and wanted you to know. Call. Bye. Sarah hung up, and moments later the answering machine turned off with a click. The rumbling had stopped, and there was only silence. Leaning back against her pillows, Heather took a deep breath. That was bad. Wes was writing the script, and she was now willing to make it. But if New Line was shelving the movie, all of the evening's information began to spin slow circles in her mind. Her head drooped to the side. Heather felt sleep coming, but welcomed it. Tomorrow would arrive that much sooner. Something crashed in the kitchen, but at first she didn't react. Then another crash, louder. Plates were falling off shelves. She leaped out of bed just as the full force of the earthquake hit. Bracing herself in the doorway, she could hear objects toppling over and breaking all over the house. This was the worst quake by far. The bedside lamp was thrown to the floor, smashing the bulb, plunging the room into darkness. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence again enveloped the room. Heather still did not move from the doorway. Seconds passed while she waited for the aftershock. Then the sound of breaking glass came from her closet, and she braced herself once more. Nothing happened. She approached the closet door attentively. What the hell is in there? She wondered. Only shoes and clothing were stored in the closet. There should be nothing breakable. She opened the closet door, and at her feet lay the shattered remains of the coffee pot. She looked back at the table where the coffee pot had been. It was no longer there. A small noise came from the closet, and she turned back around and found herself looking into the scarred, horrible face of Freddy. His eyes glinted in the scant light with immense hatred and menace. She screamed as he leaped at her, forcing her backward onto the bed. He was on her now, his very real weight pinning her down. Heather was helpless, and they both knew it. As he cocked the claw for the killing blow, Freddy pressed his burned face into hers. "Nancy!" he hissed. He drove the claw down with incredible force, just as the aftershock hit. The bed heaved beneath Heather, throwing her to the side at the last possible moment. The blades narrowly missed her throat and glanced off her arm, just as she was tossed from the bed. Her head struck the dresser, and the brightest light exploded in her mind. Then It winked out. After great effort, Heather crawled up from the deep pit inside her consciousness. When she got to the top, she was awake again. At first, it seemed nothing was wrong. Her lamp stood where it had been, unbroken. The coffee pot was intact. Only her mattress was at an odd angle on her bed, and of course, she was on the floor. She started to pull herself off the floor, pain trying to drive her back down the pit at every moment. The bedside clock blinked 12. Quake must have knocked out the power too, she thought. It wasn't until she was standing again that she realized she was bleeding. Blood oozed from 4 long slashes in her forearm. Then she remembered. "Dylan!" she yelled to no one. Ignoring her aching body, she hurried to the car. Fax cover sheet. To Dave Bergantino, Company, Cooped Up at Home Incorporated. Fax number 818-753-4475. Date June 22nd, 1994. From Katrina. Number of pages including this one, too. Comments. Hey Dave, found this article in an old Daily Variety. Ooh, scary stuff. Anyway, thought you'd want it for inspiration. Hope the writing is going well. Haven't heard from you in a while. Call me so we can go dancing, okay? Oh yeah, and watch out for Freddy. Pleasant dreams. Katrina. Daily Variety, March 15th, 1993. Page 3. EFX Tex Killed by Raymond Finley. The film world was rocked today by yet another tragic loss as the bodies of 2 special effects technicians were found in a vacant lot near Palmdale. Thomas Ferrans and Carlos Wendigo had been teamed to work on a new Nightmare on Elm Street film for New Line Cinema. Slashed. In a sinister twist, both men had been slashed to death with what were presumed to be knives in the manner of screen villain Freddy Krueger. The 2 were working on an updated version of the infamous glove for the new movie. The prop was missing from the crime scene. Police suspect theft was the motive. Curse? This was the second tragic incident in the production of what was supposed to be a top-secret project. The secret was revealed when Chase Porter, boss of Ferrans and Wendigo, died in a car accident 3 days ago when returning from Palmdale. His death, along with those of his crew, has fueled rumors of a curse on the set of the new movie. It's like someone, God maybe, doesn't want this movie made, one member of the production said anonymously. Film itself next to die? Daily Variety has learned the project is indeed on the ropes. New Line executives are said to be examining the film's potential, after signs the franchise may have run out of steam. No one at the Indie consented to be interviewed for this article.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 22nd, 1994. Okay, even though Craven changed the names, it's obvious that these guys are Chuck and Terry in the movie. Heck, he didn't even try that hard to hide it, since he used the same initials. On the other hand, who else would have a reason to search all this stuff out and put together the pieces? And why did I have to be the lucky one? Still fighting the urge to just ditch this book and write some innocuous fairy tale. The kind that doesn't come with any bizarre coincidences attached and doesn't mess with your mind. But then, if I quit this, I'll be lucky to get a job writing fortune cookies.
When she got to the hospital, Heather ran through the hallways to Dylan's room. As she approached, 2 figures stood just outside his door. One was a nurse, the other was Julie. "Julie, what are you doing here?" Heather asked. Her friend just shrugged, almost embarrassed. "I don't know. I just had this terrible dream that Dylan was in danger." She stopped and looked down as if deciding whether to go on. "I had to come over." Then she laughed nervously and looked up. "You must think I'm crazy." Heather shook her head humorlessly. "No, I don't think that at all. How is he?" They wouldn't let me," Julie said when something caught her eye over Heather's shoulder. Heather turned to find Dr. Hefner regarding her with a pained smile. "Miss Langenkamp, I'm afraid there are no evening visitor hours in intensive care." As she spoke, she placed herself between Heather and Dylan's door. Her tone sounded like she had just caught Heather doing something naughty. Heather ignored it. "Is he all right?" "Dylan, he's holding well," the doctor told her evenly. "Earlier he had some problems," she added, sounding unconcerned. "He's in an oxygen tent now." "Oh, my God!" Heather instantly forgot Dr. Hefner even existed until she found the doctor blocking the door to Dylan's room. She didn't look like she was going to move. "It looks like we've had an accident, Mrs. Langenkamp." The doctor had grabbed her gently but firmly by the injured arm. "May I?" Without waiting for a response, Dr. Hefner pulled back Heather's sleeve, uncovering the slash wounds. Heather tried to pull away, but the doctor held tight. "These are nasty cuts. How?" Heather cut in. She didn't have time for this. "It happened during the earthquake. I fell." She hoped Dr. Hefner would be satisfied, but it was clear she was not. Too bad. Heather pushed forward again. "I want to see Dylan." But the doctor still did not move. "In a moment. First, let's see about you." She locked Heather in her steely gaze once more. Again it seemed Heather had no choice. She nodded slightly, assenting to be led away. Before she went with Dr. Hefner, she glanced at Julie, silently pleading with her to stay put. Julie winked back at her. Message received. In the dispensary, Dr. Hefner tended to Heather's cuts. She wanted to be with Dylan, but she had to be careful of this woman. The look in her eyes said she was dangerous. Her eyes also said she thought Heather was dangerous. "If these had been a few inches nearer the wrist," said Dr. Hefner rhetorically, as she cleansed the wound with antiseptic. Then, a little too casually, she asked, "What did you say you cut yourself on?" "I didn't, and I'm not going to." "It was an earthquake, and it was dark," Heather answered tersely. "I have no idea." "These look quite fresh." Heather was losing patience. "They are," she snapped. "It happened in tonight's quake." Dr. Hefner frowned, obviously not understanding. "It happened just 15 minutes ago. You must have felt it." But Dr. Hefner had not. "Guess we lucked out over here," she said with her thin-lipped smile. Heather was being humored. Of course the doctor hadn't felt the quake. It had happened in Heather's dream, where she got the cuts. But she couldn't tell Dr. Hefner that. "Your son apparently is terrified of a man. Someone who he thinks is going to come out of his bed." Dr. Hefner studied her for a reaction. Heather gave her nothing. "One of the nurses heard him talking in his sleep." Then she moved in as she bandaged the wound. "You have any idea who that man might be, Mrs. Langenkamp?" For emphasis, she bound the gauze tightly with the clip. Heather winced. The doctor's words made her realize one important thing she had forgotten. "I meant to bring him his dinosaur Rex. Rex keeps Freddy from—" She stopped, but it was too late. Dr. Hefner's eyes flared darkly triumphant. "The man from your films? Freddy Krueger? With the claws? Is that who he's afraid of?" Her eyes flicked briefly to the bandage on Heather's arm. Then she turned on Heather with her arresting gaze. "You have let your child see your films, haven't you?" Heather stood and faced Dr. Hefner. "I'm not going to take much more of this shit," she thought. "What's happening is a lot more serious than your academic notions of child psychology." She glared at Dr. Hefner. "Every kid knows about Freddy," she hissed. "He's like Santa Claus or King Kong." Dr. Hefner stepped back as if she thought Heather would attack her. And this time she was the first to look away. When she looked back again, her more generic, less threatening professional manner had returned. "I see. Well, interesting talking to you, Mrs. Langenkamp." Dr. Hefner was a bit flustered by this encounter. "I hope you understand my concerns are simply for the welfare of your son." She left the room with one last flash of her thin smile. Heather understood instantly that this was only a strategic retreat on Dr. Hefner's part. She was merely going off to plan her next move. In the meantime, Heather was going to be with Dylan, planning their next move. When she returned to his room, the nurse was still standing guard, keeping Julie out. Heather walked to the door and the nurse immediately stepped aside. Apparently her expression told the nurse it would be in her best interest to let her in to see her son. However, the nurse kept the door open so she could keep watch. Dylan was barely visible through the oxygen tent. What she could see was a frail, tortured child who most definitely was not schizophrenic. She wanted to take his hand and hold it through the tent, but resisted. It might not be good for Dylan, and the nurse might mistake the gesture in any event. It seemed like a paranoid thought, but the way Dr. Hefner was acting, it was better to be safe. Being close to him had to be enough for now. She leaned on the rail at the side of the bed. Really, there was nothing she could do until he woke up. He wasn't anywhere she could go and bring him back. So she would have to keep watch. Meanwhile, the nurse was keeping watch on her. Another nurse walked by, and the two exchanged suspicious whispers as they glanced in her direction. Heather didn't feel particularly bothered by them. They were only doing their job, and she was doing hers as a mother, and that took precedence. Soon, however, Heather found herself nodding. Her head dropped forward, and she jerked it up again. Luckily, she'd only drifted off for a moment. Suddenly, the monitor above Dylan gave off a shrill alarm. Jagged lines danced on a small screen. Dylan twisted inside the tent. Then he convulsed, his back arcing and slamming into the bed like he was experiencing cardiac arrest. She jumped up and started screaming for help. And her own screaming woke her up. She was on her feet as nurses rushed into the room, wondering what was going on. Heather looked at them and clamped her hand over her mouth. The room was quiet now. No alarm from the machine, just a soft beeping that indicated everything was all right. She turned back to the tent and saw that Dylan was sitting up, staring at her through the plastic. He reached up and slowly unzipped the tent, revealing a cold, harsh expression that was utterly unlike him. Heather had started to lean down to him when she saw his face and froze. Then she realized he was leaning out of his tent. "Dylan, honey, you shouldn't do that," she said, and started to reach for him. His face made her stop a second time, but it was no longer his face. His features shifted into an uncanny imitation of a twisted old man. "Too late!" Freddy's voice boomed out of Dylan's mouth. "I'm almost there, Heather! Almost there!" With that, his entire body contracted, and he vomited, black-green muck showering her. The feeling on her skin was like battery acid. As she fell back, trying to wipe away the stinging globs that clung to her, she glimpsed insects and worms writhing in her hair. She was choking in disgust when a strong arm pulled her back and flung her out of the way. Emergency machinery and nurses flew by, converging on Dylan's bed. They obscured her view of him, but she could hear him crying now. It was his own voice, and he was terrified. She tried to crowd in with the nurses. Her son was calling for her. Dr. Hefner appeared at the door. She strode in with grim determination on her face and roughly shoved the nurses away from Dylan's bed. Heather reached up to get the doctor's attention. "Doctor!" Dr. Hefner turned on her like a rabid dog and glared. Heather shrank back. Then the doctor turned to the nurses and yelled. She was acting like a woman possessed. "Get her back! I've got to go in! Get me a full anesthetic! Stat!" "We don't have any here, doctor," said one of the nurses meekly. She, too, was devastated by one of Dr. Hefner's incendiary glares. Then the doctor wheeled around to see Dylan. He was desperately clawing at the oxygen tent. It fell away, and he reached out for his mother. "Screw it, then!" bellowed Dr. Hefner. "I'm going in!" She reached forward as if to push Dylan back into the bed, but instead savagely tore the hospital gown from him. "Cut this evil out of him!" As she roared, she thrust her right hand into her medical bag, then withdrew it. Instead of her hand, she pulled out the claw, customized for this medical nightmare. The razors were replaced by deadly scalpels. The crazed Dr. Hefner raised the claw, preparing to plunge them into Dylan's chest. Heather dived forward and landed on Dylan's empty bed. Hands grabbed at her and she struggled against them. Finally, she was roughly flipped onto her back. She stared up at several nurses who had been trying to subdue her. Their faces were tangled in long, translucent strips. They seemed as startled as she was. She went limp, realizing that she had been dreaming, and they released her. "Now what have you done to yourself, miss?" said one nurse. Heather looked down at her arm to find blood seeping from under the bandage. As she reached to touch it, she realized what the translucent strips were. She sat up so quickly the nurses jumped back in surprise. Heather stepped away from the bed and turned. Dylan's oxygen tent was shredded. She turned to the nurses with wild eyes. "He's got him!" she screamed. "He's got my Dylan!" The nurses came forward to subdue her again, but stopped in their tracks. They eyed her in shock. Heather glimpsed herself in the mirror above the hospital room sink. A gray streak had appeared in her hair. The nurses recovered from the shock and began to move toward her again. They were tense, preparing for a struggle. Heather could see that they thought she was insane, and dangerously so, but she didn't care. Who's got him?" asked one nurse. "Freddy," Heather said in a low, clear voice. This stopped the nurse again. "Freddy?" asked another. Apparently she thought this was a tension breaker, because she started laughing. "Who? Freddy Krueger or something?" Dr. Hefner, the real one, Heather was certain, entered at that moment. She assessed the situation and pasted on her professional manner. It seemed ready to fall off at any moment. She asked what the problem was. "My baby," Heather pleaded. "Freddy's got my baby! He's got my Dylan!" The nurses looked at each other, not as amused as they were before. Neither was Dr. Hefner, who grabbed her by the arm and shook her hand. "Mrs. Langenkamp!" growled Dr. Hefner. Once she had Heather's attention, she went on in a more civilized tone, but the underlining threat was clear. "I suggest you go home and get some rest. Your son is fine. He's been taken downstairs for further testing." He was just here," Heather protested. Dr. Hefner took a deep breath. When she spoke, it was as if to a small, mentally handicapped child. "He was here. You fell asleep. We took him." She paused, waiting for her words to sink in. Then she added a note of extreme concern and sympathy to her tone. "You look so exhausted. Frankly, we didn't want to wake you. Besides, the young woman Julie is with him. Believe me, everything is fine." Heather did not believe her. "Everything is not fine," she snapped, and stormed out of the room. From behind her she heard Dr. Hefner call out to a nurse. "Call security." Heather's pace quickened in her search for Dylan. She ducked down some stairs and emerged 2 floors below, trying to remember exactly where the testing area was located. A group of nurses intercepted her in the hallway. Heather barreled right through them and they ran to catch up. As she strode through the hall, she opened every door behind which she saw a light. In the process, she saw many things. Patients sleeping, drug closets, a restroom, but no Dylan. "Where is he?" she demanded. "This is a restricted area," answered one nurse. "Do you have a pass?" The nurse took firm hold of Heather's shoulder. Heather stopped abruptly and 2 other nurses collided. She shoved the grabby nurse away. "Screw your pass," Heather snarled, and started to walk away. Dr. Hefner appeared at the end of the hall and flagged her down. "It's all right now," she said as she approached with another nurse. "Miss Langenkamp, just remain calm." Then she turned to the nurse that accompanied her and asked her smugly, "Tell us how our boy is doing." The nurse looked at Heather, then back to Dr. Hefner. Immediately she appropriated Dr. Hefner's dislike for Heather, and the doctor's smugness. "He's fine, actually. He came out of a coma 10 minutes ago." Then she lowered her voice and whispered to the doctor, It's looking like acute sleep deprivation. I don't think she ever lets the kid get a night's sleep. Munchausen syndrome, Dr. Hefner mused. Heather saw them whispering and pushed closer. What are you saying? Where is he? Only one nurse stood between her and Dr. Hefner. She was calculating how easy it would be to reach the doctor and force her to say where they were hiding Dylan when a door opened behind Heather. 2 security guards stepped into the hallway and marched toward the gathering. Then a voice cried out from the other direction. Over here, Heather! Julie stood, waving from a doorway, smiling broadly. Heather had nearly forgotten she was at the hospital. Thank God she's here, Heather thought. Taking a deep breath, she locked her eyes on Julie and moved toward her. As she passed Dr. Hefner, the doctor gestured with her hand, and Heather heard the security guard's footsteps halt. Got someone here who wants to see you, Julie beamed. When Heather reached the door, she ran inside and found Dylan sitting on an examination table. As soon as he saw Heather, he held out his arms. He looked so tired and pale. Heather swept him up into an embrace. You okay, champ? She whispered as she held him. The others would be here in a moment, and they would soon have no privacy. Can we get Rex now? The bad man's getting awful close. I know he is, sweetie. We'll both go get Rex right now. She lifted Dylan off the table. Regardless of how he looked, his spirit remained intact. He reminded her so much of his father at this moment. The problem was identified, and for himself he saw the solution. If only Rex was the answer that would help them all. She turned with Dylan in her arms and found Dr. Hefner standing in the doorway. I'm afraid Dylan really should stay with us until we know what's causing these episodes, Miss Langenkamp. I'm sure you understand. Her voice said she wasn't fooling around, and if Heather failed to cooperate, there would be consequences. Heather thought quickly. She wanted Dylan out of here and safe at home with Rex, but even she wouldn't be let out of here if she tried to fight Dr. Hefner. There was only one thing to do. She motioned Julie to join her and Dylan by the examination table. At the sign of a private conference, Dr. Hefner politely left the room. Tell you what, she said to Dylan, I'm going to go get Rex for you right now. You know home isn't far away from here, right? Right across the freeway, he answered with certainty. He really had heard, thought Heather, and remembered. That's right, she said, so I won't be long. Meanwhile, Julie's going to be here with you. You bet, chimed in Julie, not missing a beat. Heather placed Dylan back onto the table and Julie took his hand. Though he understood the situation, he wasn't happy that his mother had to leave. As she turned toward the door, he grabbed her hand. Hurry back, please. His spirit may have been intact, but it was still battered. I'm sleepy. Promise, cross my heart. Then she kissed him and said, But until Mommy gets back, Dylan, whatever you do, don't fall asleep. By the look in his eyes, she didn't have to tell him that twice. She turned to Julie. Don't let him out of your sight, and keep him awake. She waited for Julie to question her, or for the least sign she wasn't taking her seriously, but neither happened. I'll stick to him like glue, Heather. Swear to God. She wasn't merely being her agreeable self this time. She meant it. Heather hugged her, squeezed Dylan's hand in goodbye, and walked out the door. Immediately the security guards stepped from an alcove. Each grabbed one of her elbows and dragged her down the hall to the dispensary where Dr. Hefner was waiting. Do you mind? Heather said with as much annoyance as she could muster. At the moment it was quite a lot. Just a quick word, Miss Langenkamp. And then she spoke what she imagined were the magic words. For Dylan's sake. The guards seated her roughly and moved into position on either side of the door. The doctor waved away 2 nurses and turned to Heather. Her professional manner was now merely a thread she was preparing to pick off her personality. She sat on the desk, intentionally looming over Heather. The whole act would have bored Heather if she weren't so angry. Well, it's been an exciting few days for you, hasn't it, Miss Langenkamp? Heather looked at her in disgust. My husband was killed a few days ago, and that's not the half of it, she thought. If you don't mind, I've got something more important to do than to make small talk. Heather started to rise, but Dr. Hefner forced her back into the chair. Won't you please be patient? All of this is just routine. The good doctor was just itching to pick that professional thread off. Julie sat quietly with Dylan in the examination room. They talked to keep each other awake. In the back of her mind, Julie hoped Heather would be back soon. Weird things were happening, and Heather seemed to understand them. Julie sure didn't. The dream she had that night was bizarre and frightening, though frankly she had felt foolish once she arrived at the hospital. Then Heather had shown up. Julie realized then that maybe it wasn't just a dream she'd had, but perhaps a premonition. If so, then she was being warned. But about what? Not only did she not know, she couldn't even imagine. While things had been rocky for Dylan tonight, he had encountered no danger of the magnitude she had sensed in her dream. At least not that she could tell. Certainly nothing here had been as horrifying as his episode the day Chase died. She recalled that Heather had been unusually touchy that day. For a while she had considered the possibility that her friend's mental scales might be tipping. But maybe on top of the caller and the earthquake, she had sensed that something terrible was about to happen. And maybe that something terrible was Chase's accident. I'm not equipped for this, Julie thought. I'm just a granola girl. Heather, on the other hand, seemed to have a handle on everything. When she had asked Julie to keep Dylan awake, she left no doubt as to how vital that instruction was. And Dylan knew what was happening, that was certain. He didn't want to go to sleep any more than Heather wanted him to. The only real problem now seemed to be that creepy Dr. Hefner. Heather was probably keeping the doctor in the dark. That was a tough call, one that Julie didn't know if she could have made. Dr. Hefner seemed to be a person accustomed to having her way. The woman was definitely trouble. When I have kids, I won't be taking them to see this doctor, she thought, probably overcompensating for some significant slight earlier in her life. On the one hand, fighting someone like that could easily make things difficult. On the other, telling her a truth that she was incapable of believing might be worse. Julie was glad all she had to do was sit with Dylan and keep him awake until Heather came back. They played games and talked, and she kept herself from asking Dylan about sleeping or dreams or the bad man she'd heard him mention at other times. She didn't want to know, and besides, she figured, what I don't know can't hurt me. She and Dylan were playing I Spy when the nurses entered. One came directly to the table while the other went to a large cabinet across the room. She opened the cabinet and rummaged in it conspicuously. Julie went over and found the nurse holding a large needle and a small vial of clear liquid. The nurse turned toward the examination table, but Julie blocked her. "Would you mind stepping aside for one moment, miss?" she asked very politely. "As a matter of fact, I would," Julie replied as the nurse plunged the needle into the vial and filled the syringe. "What do you think you're doing?" The nurse pointed the needle to the ceiling and squeezed the air bubble out of the syringe. A small amount of fluid squirted into the air. She gave Julie a nonchalant smile. "Just a little shot to see that he gets some sleep." She started toward Dylan, but Julie grabbed her arm. Instead of fighting, the nurse just looked at her with an odd smirk. Their eyes locked for a moment. Then the nurse looked past her. "Do it," she said, and from behind Julie she heard Dylan yelp. "Ow!" Julie turned in time to see the second nurse pulling a needle from Dylan's arm. He had been watching the confrontation at the cabinet and was caught off guard. "All done," chirped the nurse standing by Dylan. Realizing what was about to happen, Dylan panicked and began to cry. "He'll be asleep in no time," said Julie's nurse with a look of self-satisfaction. "Mind letting go of my arm?" Julie looked down at her right arm, still holding tight on the nurse. She was so angry she was shaking. But she let go. The nurse thanked her and smoothed out the wrinkles on her sleeve. "Bitch!" Julie yelled suddenly, and before the nurse could react, brought her other arm around in a wicked left hook. Her fist connected solidly with the broad expanse of the nurse's right cheek, sending her flying into the hallway. She landed on her back and lay still. "Hey, you can't do that!" yelled the other nurse as she marched toward Julie. Without hesitation, Julie picked up the needle dropped by the nurse she decked and spun around. She and the other nurse leveled their respective needles at each other like Old West gunfighters. Julie was still on a roll. "I know what's in that one," Julie said. "Do you know what's in this one?" She didn't, but she was betting that the nurse didn't either. "Or what it'll do to you when I stick you with it? And I will!" She feinted, jabbing the needle slightly forward. It was no contest. The nurse dropped her needle like a hot potato and ran. Julie chased her to the doorway, slammed the door shut, and locked it. She took no time to gloat over her victory, but ran back to Dylan. His eyes were already starting to flutter as the sedative took effect. "Dylan, don't fall asleep!" She shook him. He was fighting the drug, but was losing the battle. "Dylan!" She couldn't let him fall asleep. Heather had specifically asked her to keep him awake. Dylan would be in grave danger if he fell asleep. At first, Julie thought she knew this because of how serious Heather had been. But that was not it at all. The feeling of danger from her dream had returned, full force. In the dispensary, Dr. Hefner decided to tone down her tough act. Besides, she had the guards here for the rough stuff. Trying to seem more sympathetic, she pulled up a stool so she could sit level with Heather. Then she leaned in, supposedly so the guards couldn't hear. "Mrs. Langenkamp, she faltered in a calculated fashion, "has there been any use of recreational drugs in your family? Or any history of mental disturbance?" She gave Heather a look that said, "It's all right, you can tell me." Heather's slow boil began to heat up rapidly. Every moment she wasted with the doctor was another moment Dylan was in danger, and Heather knew that this line of questioning was a dead end. Unfortunately, everything rational supported Dr. Hefner's suspicions. Worse still, it was clear she had her own agenda. But rational was not on the menu today. Heather supposed she should understand and even forgive Dr. Hefner's misguided thinking. After all, she didn't have all the necessary information. But from the beginning, the doctor had gone out of her way to be condescending, and even under normal circumstances, Dr. Hefner's question would have galled her. "What the hell are you asking?" She leaned forward, and Dr. Hefner held out her hands in a practiced, non-threatening gesture. "Please, don't take this wrong, but if there was, there's a good chance Dylan could be suffering from something passed down to him. Have you been suffering from any delusional events, Miss Langenkamp?" The gloves were off now. Dr. Hefner was now directly challenging Heather's mental stability. Heather stood, wanting to leave and deal with this later, but a guard grabbed her before she could turn and pushed her back down in the seat. "This man from your films," continued Dr. Hefner, as if she hadn't noticed. "Freddy Krueger, have you been seeing him?" Heather saw she was being given a chance to admit to her problem. If she didn't, the doctor seemed ready to take matters out of her hands. Well, matters were well out of the doctor's hands. "No," Heather responded. She began to feel a raw tingling sensation on her arm. Looking down, she saw that blood was again seeping from underneath her bandages. Dr. Hefner ignored the wound and merely looked disappointed. She shrugged as if to say she had tried, but now had no choice. The doctor began to explain Heather's alternatives to cooperation. "There are drugs, Mrs. Langenkamp. We could place Dylan in foster care for a short while. Run some tests on you." Heather cut her off by standing abruptly. She turned and bumped into the guards. They grabbed her shoulders to force her into the chair again, but she didn't yield. Instead, she whirled around and yelled into Dr. Hefner's face, "I want my kid out of here, now!" Dr. Hefner just studied her for a moment, then let her eyelids droop with even greater disappointment. "Very well, as soon as we gather the appropriate papers." In other words, thought Heather, not any time soon. With nothing left to lose, Heather decided to tell the doctor the truth. "You don't understand," she began. "If Dylan falls asleep, then—" Shouts coming from the hallway outside interrupted her. They were accompanied by the sounds of several people banging on a door. In the examination room, Julie was desperate. Soon someone would bring a key and they'd haul her away. Then Dylan would fall asleep for sure. Until then, she did her best to shake him as hard as she could without hurting him. He was trying to help her, but the drug was too strong. "Where's Mommy?" he slurred. "Where's—" And then he stopped talking and his head lolled onto his shoulder. She shook him again and his head simply rolled back. With extreme effort, he lifted his head and forced his eyes open. Only a crack, but they were open. Then he was looking behind her. Fear caused his eyelids to flutter. He was trying to raise his arm to point. "Julie, behind you." His words were barely audible. She turned and found nothing, but he continued to look past her in fear. An unseen shadow fell across her, and suddenly Julie felt several sharp objects plunged into her chest. An invisible force lifted her into the air, and her last sensation was that of balancing on a pitchfork. Her scream was cut off almost the moment it began, as her lungs were punctured. The door opened. Nurses rushed into the room to a horrible sight they could never have expected. Julie's body was hovering in midair. Then it rose slightly and smashed to the ground as if thrown. Then the invisible force dragged her across the floor, and impossibly up the wall, leaving a bloody trail. The nurses were paralyzed by the gruesome sight of the body, now sliding across the ceiling. As horrible as it was, the sheer incredible nature of the phenomenon riveted their attention. They didn't notice Dylan's eyes drift closed, then snap open, glazed with fear as if now asleep he could see what was mutilating Julie. He could. His entire body went rigid as Julie's body slithered overhead. Then the attack was over, and Julie's body dropped to the floor with a sickening smack. Blood splashed onto the nurses. Dylan ran out of the room as they began to scream.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 25th, 1994. It's been a couple of weeks since I last called LaCroix. Haven't heard from him, and frankly, with everything that's been going on, I had forgotten about him entirely. Something about the way I've been feeling lately reminded me of the way LaCroix had sounded in messages, and even in his note. So I dug out his number and dialed it again. After many rings, apparently the machine wasn't hooked up anymore, a bleary female voice answered LaCroix's phone. It sounded like I just woke her up. When I asked for Jason, there was a long silence, then she said simply, "Jason's not here." When I asked when he'd be back, there was another long, uncomfortable silence. "Jason is, died," she said in a tiny voice. At first, I was speechless. Then, before I realized it was none of my business, I found myself asking when it happened. 2 weeks ago, she replied, slightly more coherent. I felt so sorry for this girl. He was murdered, she continued. Someone broke into the apartment. Was his girlfriend, Marnie. Who is this, anyway? I told her my name and that Jason had been calling me. Did she know why? No, I don't, she said. He'd been working a lot lately, so I haven't been around much. So I can't help you. Sorry. I should have left her alone with her pain then, but I didn't. I couldn't. I told her it had seemed important to Jason that he reach me, and that he said it concerned my book. Oh, you're a writer? She asked dully. He was a writer too. I think at that point she began remembering him and became very sad. Got his first paying job too. That's why he was so busy all the time. A cold chunk of ice formed in my chest. I asked what he had been working on. A Freddy Krueger book, she answered. He was so excited about it. Then she started to cry, except I didn't hear much of it because I think I mumbled, "I'm sorry," and hung up the phone and stared at the wall for about an hour. From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 26, 1994. After the staring episode, I went to the beach and alternately dozed and wandered around for hours. Then I went to a bar and got extraordinarily majorly smashed. Luckily, I don't remember much, but I've got a hell of a hangover. I'm just lucky I was passed out instead of actually being asleep, because then I would have been in danger of dreaming, and I don't know if being drunk carries over in the dream world. If it does, then I would not have been able to defend myself. Well, here I am, a little clearer-headed and twice as frightened. Things have been occurring to me that being drunk couldn't blot out. Like, I think Freddy Krueger murdered Jason McCroy. Which means that I believe Freddy is for real. Which means that the events in the movie really took place more or less the way they're described. Which means I might very well be next on Freddy's slash list. Oh shit. But how does Jason fit in, and how did he know to contact me? He was a writer, so the only thing I can figure is that he found out through my agent. Maybe Laurel represents him too. I don't know. But that seems to be the place to start. I just hope the end doesn't come too soon.
Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 6 of Wes Craven's New Nightmare by David Bergantino. Hope you're enjoying this book so far, guys. I'm looking forward to, after I'm finished with the book, I'm going to do a completely separate review/discussion on the movie and the book as a cohesive unit, because they really do go together quite well. In the meantime, though, guys, this was the next to last upload of this book. The next upload of New Nightmare will be the conclusion of this novel. As always, tonight's upload was brought to you by the patrons on the Patreon page: Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. If you enjoy this channel and would like to contribute to the channel and sponsor it to help this channel keep going and growing for years to come, and to help me complete my goal of turning every single slasher book that is out of print into an audiobook, then head over to the link in the description, and for as low as $2 a month, guys, you can support the channel and be a patron of the 80s Slasher Librarian and get some early access to content and some really great rewards for being a patron. Check it out. It's really awesome. Alright, guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, keep it scary, and pleasant dreams!